Astronomy is one of the earliest sciences, going far back into recorded history, as we know that astronomical alignments were incorporated into the megalithic monuments of some 6,000 years ago. Human beings were always engaged by the stars and the movements of the sun, moon and planets, and from earliest times tried to find patterns in these movements. The seeking of patterns was the beginnings of the science of astronomy. From medieval times in Europe, the seeking to understand astronomical facts often took the form of emblematic and allegorical diagrams used to illustrate manuscripts and later printed books. In this presentation, we will be exploring the emblematic tradition in printed books. We will look at woodcuts and engravings found in the astronomical and astrological literature that appeared from the late 15th century. From the late 19th century, more modern depictions of astronomical ideas took over, and this emblematic perspective faded. For this presentation, I have used my own coloured versions of these emblems. This presentation will be divided into a number of sections. This early emblem shows two philosophers, a theologian and an astronomer, discussing their different approaches. The theologian relies on the beliefs found in the Bible, which is open on the lectern beside them, while the astronomer seeks to ground his ideas on observing the stars. The tension between these two approaches was irresolvable and ultimately led to the collapse of the belief-driven theological view. Medieval European astronomical ideas drew on the classical Greek concepts, in particular from the Alexandrian philosopher of the 2nd century AD, Claudius Ptolemy. A number of his writings had survived: an astronomical treatise now known as the Almagest, his Geographia, and an astrological treatise, the Apotelesmatica, more commonly known as the Tetrabiblos. These works were printed throughout the 16th century. Here we see him shown using a quadrant to measure angles between the heavenly bodies. The Shepherd's Calendar shows a more naive encounter with the heavens. Here we see a peasant contemplating the stars, seeking some insight into changes in the weather, the time to plant, reap a harvest, or the correct time to hunt certain animals. There was at that time a body of ideas conveyed through an oral tradition about the influences of the stars and planets on earthly events. This contrasted with a more scientific investigation using measurement and intellectual analysis. These two 16th century woodcuts show astronomers using instruments to measure angles between objects in the heavens. On the left, he uses a pointing device known as a Jacob's rod in surveying. It has a movable cursor which allows for the measurement and comparison of different angles. On the right, our astronomer, here Albumasar, uses a set of adjustable compasses. Another source for astronomical ideas were the Arabic writers on the subject. To a great extent, during the last half of the first millennium, the Arabic philosophers preserved and commented upon the earlier Greek science and served to transmit this to medieval Europe. Here, 3 Arabic natural philosophers used various instruments to measure the positions of objects on the earth and in the heavens. The one on the right uses a quadrant to measure angles of the stars and planets. The central figure uses a surveyor's device to measure objects on the earth, while on the left a philosopher is creating a sundial which measures time through the movements of the sun. Here we see two astronomers transferring measurements of angles onto a globe. There were thus two globes, a terrestrial one showing the land and the seas, and a celestial one showing the constellations and zodiacal band. The 16th century woodcut on the left shows a philosopher using the stars to create navigational charts. In the background we see this being put to use on a sea voyage. The 17th century woodcut on the right depicts Ptolemy as a king holding an armillary sphere, a sort of model of the heavens, also known as the spherical astrolabe used for navigation. In this late 16th century copperplate engraving, we see the early 16th century Florentine explorer and navigator Amerigo Vespucci holding up an armillary sphere. He developed a complex method for estimating longitude. Being in the southern hemisphere, the constellation of the Southern Cross shines out. The woodcut from a Peter Appian book shows the parallel use of surveying instruments in mapping the earth and the heavens. The woodcut on the right depicts two astronomers trying to incorporate the arrival of a comet onto their maps of the heavens. In the late 16th century, there was still a struggle between the observational science of exact astronomy with the belief-driven views of conventional Christianity. Here, the word of Jehovah is elevated as the complete truth. Only a few years later, Giordano Bruno was condemned and burnt at the stake for promoting a different perspective on astronomy. On the right, three philosophers seem to adhere to a naive and devotional view of the heavenly bodies. Tycho Brahe, 1546 to 1601, was a very influential observational astronomer. Using his mural quadrant at his Uraniborg Observatory on the island of Sven, between Denmark and Sweden, together with clocks, he made very accurate measurements of the position of the planets and stars in the sky. His work established a solid basis for observational astronomy and signalled the downfall of the belief-driven approach. In the 19th century, illustrators often still drew on the images of centuries earlier, creating a somewhat romanticised and often anachronistic view of ancient astronomers. The image on the left purports to show an Egyptian astronomer, though he or she is surrounded by 16th and 17th century equipment. Even the sighting rod is depicted with three cursors, an arrangement which would not work in practice. These illustrations were entirely governed by aesthetic rather than practical or historical accuracy concerns. From the earliest times, human beings puzzled over how the world around them came into being and explored various models of cosmogenesis. Before the construction of a viable physics which could explain how the cosmos arose, humanity was faced with a seemingly unsolvable mystery. The solution was to posit the existence of a supernatural God. Here we see a conventional Christian depiction of God creating the heavens and the earth. This simplistic invoking of a supreme creator as a device to avoid the unanswerable questions nevertheless inspired some truly delightful artworks, often illustrating Bibles. On the left, this engraving shows God creating the planets using a stream of fire. This echoes the classical Greek idea articulated in Ovid's Metamorphoses that the divine created the elements of the world out of chaos, densifying the primal chaos into fire, then air, water, and finally solid earth. Some writers, often working within an alchemical worldview, though still believing in a creator deity, sought to provide some insights into the mechanism through which this god acted. Thus, Robert Fludd, in the early decades of the 17th century, produced a wonderful series of engravings through which he wanted to show how the cosmos arose out of nothing. His series begins with empty space stretching to infinity on all sides. Within this space, a sphere of light appears, the fiery creation of the first day. The light shines into the centre of the darkness, or the abyss of Hyle, the primal matter. This light from the Empyrean descends down towards the centre and densifies to form a middle spirit. This is the division of the waters. The densified substances, becoming the four elements, begin to struggle and fight against each other, forming a kind of chaos. Part of this conglomerated mass densifies and falls further down into the centre of the abyss, forming the central sun. The other elements form into layers according to their densities. The substance of the universe now divides into a subtle, spiritual, bodiless part and a material part. This lower matter in turn divides into a finer part and a dense sublunary component. Thus the cosmos appears now to have three realms or heavens within it. God decides to form the macrocosm out of this primal matter through the breath of his mouth circling around to form a sphere of light in the darkness. The macrocosm was now full of created light, which pushed the darkness downwards, which gave rise to the Empyrean sphere. The tenuous light now densifies and descends further down to form the middle sphere, or ethereal heaven. The elementary sphere now begins to form. At its outer margin, which is the lowest part of the upper spiritual sphere, the realm of elementary fire begins to appear. Descending further from the sphere of elementary fire, we now see a sphere of elementary earth separating itself from the more subtle fire. And finally, the spheres of air and water emerge between the realm of fire and the sphere of the earth. Fludd, though still wedded to the conventional Christian idea of creation out of God, attempts to give the spiritual account a mechanism through which it acted. He thus created a truly wonderful cosmology and picture of how the world was created. It was short-lived, and some 60 years later Newton was to create his Principia, which provided the mathematical basis for an exact physics that in our modern age made it possible to develop a totally mechanistic cosmology that needed no recourse to mysterious spiritual principles. Fludd, with his ideas of spheres of energy gradually densifying, was, however, not so far from modern conceptions. From the earliest times, the naive but entirely natural idea arose that the earth was at the centre of the cosmos and the planets and stars revolved around our world. This became rigidified in the medieval period as a set of concentric spheres, each of which bore one of the 7 then known planets. The image on the left shows the globe of the Earth with the 7 planetary spheres above it, and 3 additional spheres, one for the fixed stars, another for the primum mobile that served to move those spheres, and above that the realm of the empyrean heaven. On the right we see Atlas bearing the world on his shoulders. Here depicted around the globe is a cosmic armillary sphere. This structure of ascending spheres allowed more associations with aspects of the spiritual magical system current in the 16th and 17th centuries. Thus each sphere was also associated with an angel, a metal, and even one of the organs of the human body. This model of the heavens served to provide a seeming mechanism for the supposed astrological influences on the earth and even on human beings. In this engraving we see rays of influence emanating from each planet in its sphere onto a human being. The various angles between the planets, opposition, quartile, sextile, etc., were said to strengthen or weaken these occult influences. This system of astrological and planetary correspondences was often elaborated into rather complex systems. Here we see the various ways in which the planets were thought to influence the internal organs of the human body. This provided indications to doctors as to which medicines to prescribe for different conditions. This picture of planetary spheres to some extent survived the discovery from more precise observations and calculations that the Earth could no longer be seen as the centre of the cosmos, and that this place had to be given to the Sun. On the left is the title page from a book extolling the new view of the structure of the cosmos. On the right is another mid-17th century engraving in which the two figures weigh the two rival systems, the Ptolemaic and the Copernican, in the balance. Johannes Kepler's life spanned the transition from the ancient system to the more modern structure of the cosmos. It was he who in 1609 discovered the mathematics that described the planetary orbits. However, back in 1596, he was still struggling with the older system and even attempted to map the planetary spheres onto Platonic solids. By the mid-1600s, a mere 50 years after condemning Giordano Bruno, the intellectuals in the Catholic Church had embraced the new sun-centred cosmos, as we see in this engraving from one of the books of the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher. It became obvious to any observer that the sun, moon and planets do not appear in any place on the sky, but in a narrow band called the zodiac. This is the conventional picture of the zodiacal band, divided into 12 zones, each of 30 degrees, the signs of the zodiac. The creator of this image has also shown the two solstices and equinoxes. The zodiacal band is thus a key component of the armillary sphere. The woodcut on the left also indicates the two tropics, that of Cancer and Capricorn, as well as the Arctic and Antarctic circles. In the 16th century, it became quite established to create star maps of the constellations as two hemispheres projected onto a circle. The earliest example probably being the woodcut created by Dürer in 1515. The image here by Peter Appian from some 20 years later is in much the same style, but especially highlights the zodiac as a band. The image of the zodiac, with its 12 constellations, was of prime importance in astrology. On the left we see the Earth surrounded by the 7 planets, then the zodiac, and the astrological construction of the houses, which has no observational reality. From the earliest times that humans looked to the skies, they observed that there were some stars that moved. The Greeks named them the planets, meaning wandering stars. They were almost immediately mythologized, and elaborate myths woven around them. It became a convention for artists creating woodcuts in the 16th century to make a series of the 7 planets, depicting them as human figures and incorporating elements from their mythology. The moon is shown as Diana the huntress holding the lunar crescent and her hunting horn. Mercury appears with his caduceus in the style of a scholar, being associated with sharp intellect and learning. Venus is the goddess of passionate love, so here holds a flaming heart and one of Cupid's arrows. The sun appears as a grand king, bearing a sceptre and orb. Mars is depicted as a war god, appropriately wearing a suit of armour and bearing a flag of victory. Jupiter is shown here in the garb of a lawmaker dispensing justice. Saturn appears with his reaping sickle and artificial leg. Another way that the graphic artists of the 16th and 17th centuries were to depict the planets was to show them seated in their chariots. These were the vehicles which supposedly transported them through the zodiac. These were drawn by animals appropriate to the individual planet's mythology. Thus, Mercury's chariot is drawn by 2 roosters, while that of Venus has Cupid directing 2 birds. Mars has his hunting dogs, Jupiter 2 peacocks, and Saturn is drawn by 2 dragons. The representation of the planets was also elaborated even further with the creation of a series of images which came to be known as the Planetenkinder, the children of the planets. These were usually large woodcuts or engravings, with a panel showing how the planets were thought to influence our human life on Earth. Here Luna influences hunting, and Mercury the arts and sciences. Venus presides over a garden of love, while the sun rules over a palace with its court of young gentlemen who sport and play around in the gardens. Mars inevitably rules the battlefield, while Jupiter has the image of the Pope dispensing spiritual and temporal law. Saturn here presides over the ordinary life of people, which is ruled by time. This series of woodcuts is ascribed to Georg Pence, though he obviously borrowed his imagery from Hans Beham. Images of the planets continue to be a popular theme, and many engravings were made in the 17th and 18th centuries. Comets were named as such because they appeared to be stars with long hairy tails. In the medieval period, well into the 17th century, the mysterious appearance of comets were thought to presage or even bring about war, pestilence and famine. In time, more accurate observation led to their movements being more understood. In 1680, Newton devised mathematics to calculate the orbit of a comet that had then appeared, and it became obvious that they were not mysterious occult elements, but merely components of our solar system. Astronomy, in the medieval and early modern era, was more than merely a view of the stars. As we have seen, it had an impact on how people saw the world around them. It provided a basis for the pseudoscience of astrology, whose ideas were seen to work in all aspects of human life, even in medicine, agriculture, and meteorology. Astronomy came to challenge the established fundamentalist religious ideas about our place in the cosmos. Centuries before modern physics had sufficiently developed to clearly answer questions about the origin of the world, precise astronomical observations weakened a naive view of a God-driven cosmos. For some years, these two worldviews, that of simplistic religious belief and clear evidence-based observation, uneasily coexisted until in the 19th century modern physical ideas became ascendant. Much of this is recorded in the wonderful emblems that artists created to illustrate the books of the late 15th through into the 18th centuries. This presentation is merely a short survey of this wealth of material.